Tonight's subject, I think, is a very important one, not just historically, but because of the fact that it can help Jews understand the times that we live in now. I think that that's the main function of history. Schor yemos olam binu shnos dor vador shalo vicha v'yageitcha zkedecha v'yomru loch. So Moshe Rabbeinu did not intend for us to know facts or dates or places or events, which is the pretty usual and sterile stuff of history. And the way history is taught, the way scholars teach history. I don't mean to denigrate scholars, but the nature of historians is that they are not really relevant to what the world is during their lifetime. I'm a Civil War buff. I'm very interested in the United States Civil War. I've read tens and tens of books on the subject. It has nothing to do with Torah, but it gives me drushes on Shabbos, which is worth something. It's worth a great deal to a rabbi. And I have visited many Civil War battlefields in the United States. Worse than that, I've subjected my family to visiting many Civil War battlefields, and they are not interested in the American Civil War. So once in a moment of madness, I attended a lecture by one of the leading Civil War historians, and he discussed many important events, the ideas of Lincoln and others in the American Civil War. And then his conclusion was, he says, of course, everything that I've told you is something that happened 130 years ago and really cannot help us in our present situation. And I thought to myself that a person who could say that the Battle of Gettysburg, or the Gettysburg Address, or the Emancipation Proclamation, or all of the events, it was the largest effusion of blood that the United States has ever spent on any war. It's over 650,000 dead. No war, even the modern wars that the United States fought in the Second World War, the United States did not suffer that number of dead. How can you say it has no effect when the problems that it raised are the basic problems that America has yet to solve? Well, the same thing is true. We're going to talk about an event that occurred almost 900 years ago. But everything about these events and how they impinged on the Jewish world, on the Christian world, on the Muslim world, all of these issues are alive and present today. And I have no advice for the current Israeli government or for the past Israeli government or for anyone. I'm trying to figure out yet where the number 7 bus goes. And it doesn't always go to the same place every time I get on. But I think that somehow, again, I know this is going to sound very immodest, but I noticed that in this country, modesty doesn't always get you even to the number 7 bus, or on it at least. But I think that if the foreign minister, the Rosh Memshalah, the people who think that they're in charge, would understand 900 years of Jewish history, I think they would have a firmer grip on the situation. Doesn't mean they can do anything more or less. Leiv Malachim V'Sorim B'Yad Hashem, Chazal said. Chazal say a great halacha, that if a king loses something, if the Prime Minister of Israel loses something, so the halacha, the Gemara in Bava Metzia tells us that if a Jew loses something, so after a period of time, he's miyayish, he gives up. He says in front of other people, "Vaili michesorin kis." I'm sorry, I lost it. You know, that was the best watch I had, and now it's lost. I can never get it back. So that's called yiyush. And the halacha is that once the owner, the loser, is miyayish, then the finder is the keeper. Because since the original owner was miyayish, that whoever finds it now acquires it from hefker, acquires it from no ownership. And if there's no ownership, then if you pick it up, it belongs to you. But the Talmud says a king, a leader, a HaNassi, there's no yiyush by a king. Why? Because his choices are impinged kaviyachol by the Rabboni Shalom. Leiv Malachim v'sorim biyad Hashem. God controls him. If God controls him, then you cannot say he gave up on finding it. He said, "I'm miyayish." He didn't say anything. He becomes a conduit for the divine will, for the providential guidance which has brought us until this day. But understanding what happened 900 years ago, I think is vital to understanding what is happening now. With that brilliant preface, we can begin. As I discussed with you over the past 2 Tuesdays, the world of Rashi, the world of the Middle Ages, of the Ashkenazim, was a very narrow and tight and small world. However, the Jews, even though they didn't live as well as their brethren did in Spain, and even though they did not rise to high office or have important posts in the governments of, in the feudal governments of France or Germany, the Jews lived, relatively speaking, peacefully, well, and in security until the Crusades. Chazal tell us that when you live in a country, you adopt the forms of the country. That's true no matter where the Jews have been in the world. And those Jews who lived in the United States remain Americans. Those, you don't live 900 years among the Poles and not become Polish. And the Jews who lived in the medieval world were part of the medieval world. One of the most interesting things that I find, for instance, Tosafot mentions in the Sukkah, and the Rosh brings it in his Chuvas, that at Jewish chasanas, at Jewish weddings in the Middle Ages, they would have a tournament of jousting. That the young boys, the yeshiva boys, would get on horses with lances, and they try and push the other guy off the horse, which was the exact same tournament that the knights, the famous jousting tournaments that were part of the Middle Ages. So Tosfos and the Rosh discussed the halacha. What if he pushed him off the horse and he tore his suit? Or if he broke his bones? Is he obligated in the halacha for paying for the man's damages? So Tosfos there says the famous rule, which anyone who has ever gone to a ball game knows, that if God forbid you're hit by a foul ball, the Yankees are not going to pay you. That's called assumption of the risk. If you walk into the stadium, you assume all the risks. Well, if you participate in a jousting tournament, so Tosfos says that you assume the risk. And if you assume the risk, then no one pays you. That rule applies Purim, Tosfos says. There's a tshuva in the Maran Mintz. Purim, people lulav is a Simchas Torah, right? You go to shul, somebody kicks you in the shins. You go to a chasana and the waiter spills hot soup over you. Can't complain. That's all part of being Jewish. That's the assumption of you don't want it to happen, don't go. No one told you to go. So on the little card that you get to respond, you should answer, I'm not coming because the waiter may pour hot soup, or certainly will pour hot soup over me. You're entitled to answer that. But if you go, there's no liability. Can you imagine yeshiva boys on horses jousting? But if you go to a Jewish wedding today, the behavior at the wedding and the costumes and the bands and everything else, it's all part of the society that one lives in. It's always been that way. And because of that, therefore, the Jews in the Christian countries in the early Middle Ages felt themselves to be part of the society. They were separate from it. They didn't participate in it, but they were part of it. And that's very important for us to remember, because, for instance, Rashi had a great yeshiva in Troyes. So in the year 1095, the Jewish community in Troyes was well established, prosperous, protected. It had its own separate quarter, its own gates. It was under the protection of the noblemen. In the year 1096, a terrible pogrom occurred. The Crusaders came, killed hundreds of Jews, almost destroyed the entire Jewish quarter. What happened in 1 year? Well, what happened in 1923 when 1/3 of the cabinet of the Weimar Republic in Germany was Jewish? And 10 years later, Hitler was in power. And 15 years later, Europe was Judenreich. We're accustomed that it takes a long time for things to come. But everything in our experience shows that it doesn't. It's like someone turns out the light switch on us. 1 minute it's this way, and the next minute it's just the other way. That's true in the economy of countries, and the economy and the wealth of people. 2 years ago, there are certain people I know people that left good jobs to go to work for certain people because that was a better job. This year, it's bankruptcy. How did that happen? The uncertainty of life, the uncertainty of events in Jewish history is one of the basic lessons. People make long-term plans, 5-year plans. There's a famous parable that's mentioned. We ask every Rosh Chodesh, when we bench Rosh Chodesh, so we hand in a long laundry list, so to speak, the Rabboni Shalom, Sitei Lonu Chaim Aruchim, Chaim Shal Shalom, Chaim Shal Parnosa, you got a whole list, give. What are we asking for? It was already written down, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, right? For Rosh Hashanah, Yikosevun, V'Yom Yom Kippur, Yechosevun. It's all decided already. So then what are you nudging again for? So a chassid once asked that to the Kotzker. So the Kotzker told him as follows. He said, listen, he says, if a person is a wealthy person, and let's say he wants to travel from New York to San Francisco, so he buys a direct through ticket, one flight, non-stop. What if he's a schnorr? He only has 10 agarot in his pocket. So he buys a ticket from New York to Cleveland. Then he buys a ticket, he gets money in Cleveland, he goes to Detroit. Then he goes to Chicago. Then he goes to Iowa. Then he goes to Kansas City. Come. At the end of the year, he comes to San Francisco. He said, sure, Rosh Hashanah, Yikosevun, V'Yom Kippur, Yechosevun, Tzaddikim, so they get written down in the book. They don't have to ask again. He said, we're all going on the local. Nobody here is going on the direct flight. So let's get through this month. Next month we'll ask again, right? First we'll get to Cleveland. Then we'll see where we're going to go from there. in Jewish history, all grandiose, long-range plans look ludicrous, because they are all subject to certain and sudden cancellation. No one knows what the morrow brings. So in 1095, the Jews in France and Germany were firmly established. In 1096, they were almost destroyed. What happened? Well, a few things happened. Again, in the broad view of history, there are many, many forces that are at work at all times. And most of the time, the forces have nothing to do with us. The Jews had nothing to do with the Crusaders. They did not bring them, they did not foment them, they could not stop them, they had no defense against them. Just as for most events, you look back on the Holocaust, so in retrospect, we all have good suggestions what should have been done. But the reality was that it was not within our control to do anything. It's part of our frustration as human beings that we can't do anything. And therefore we find it very difficult to accept. But the truth of the matter is that there are many things involved that have nothing to do with us. And because they have nothing to do with us, we're almost a bystander, even though what is going to happen is going to happen directly to us. The Pope of Rome was engaged in a power struggle with the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, which was founded by Charlemagne in the 8th century, saw itself as the successor to the Roman Empire. And it called itself the Holy Roman Empire because the other empire was unholy, because the other empire was pagan, and this Roman Empire was Christian. And therefore they called themselves the Holy Roman Empire, for which the historians have one of their standard jokes, that it was not holy, and it was not Roman, and it was not an empire. And the seat of the Holy Roman Empire was in the city of Aachen. Today it's the French city of Aix-la-Chapelle. It has changed hands between France and Germany 46 times. That's one of the facts that I researched. 46 times it has changed hands between France and Germany, and it may not be over yet. Today France still has it. And that was the capital, the palace that Charlemagne built for himself. And there's a great cathedral there. And that was the seat of the Holy Roman Empire. Now the question was, throughout the Middle Ages, who was in charge? Was the Pope in charge, and the Emperor had to do what the Pope said? Or was the Pope's business to mine people's souls? And the Emperor, who was in charge of running the empire, really did not have to listen to the Pope. In our time it's academic, because as Stalin said, the Pope, how many divisions does the Pope have? He has no temporal power any longer. But in the 11th century, the Pope had armies. The Pope controlled land. And the Pope went to war on a regular basis against other Christian leaders. The Pope was looking to assert dominance over the Christian world. And the Pope that was the Pope then, and it was called Urban II, he, at the same time, was looking to reform the Catholic Church. He was looking for a purer church, for a more religious church, if I could use that word. He was looking to cleanse it from many of the corruptions that had already sunk into the church. And he was looking for a vehicle by which he could gain at one and the same time control over the church and control over the empire. That's one piece of the story. This is all while Rashi is writing this page. Rashi has nothing to do with this. Second piece of the puzzle were the Muslims. The Muslims, beginning in the 7th century, were on the ascent in the world. The Muslims almost conquered Europe. They were defeated in the 8th century at the battle outside of Vienna by Charles Martel, French king. If he would not have stopped them, then Europe probably would be Muslim and not Christian. And the Muslims conquered Spain, and the Muslims controlled all of the trade in the Mediterranean area, so that all the materials that the European Christians wanted to import or needed for Europe had to come through the hands of the Muslims. The Jews, especially the Jews in Spain, were in alliance with the Muslims, and the silk route, the spice route. In Europe, salt was the most valuable of all things, because without salt you could not preserve foods. If you go to the Tower of London and see the British royal jewels, of which they have a number, you will notice there what to the trained Jewish eye looks like psalmim boxes. Hundreds of psalmim boxes. So you'll say, what in the world are they doing with so many Havdalah psalmim boxes? The answer is that those are not psalmim boxes. Those were silver, gold, diamond encrusted boxes that were meant to hold salt. And salt was so valuable that you did not put it into a salt shaker, but you put it into this enormously expensive, ornate. And the Jews, when they came to make psalmim boxes, copied the pattern, the towers, the turrets. But salt was tremendously valuable in Europe. And salt somehow came from the east. All the spices came from the east. And it was controlled by the Muslims. The Muslims also controlled this country, this city, exactly where we are sitting. The Muslims, for many centuries, allowed the Christians access to the Christian holy places that exist in this country. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. They charged the fee, much as the Jews today also charge a fee. The fee is collected in many ways, airport taxes, the bus, whatever. There's 100 ways to collect the fee and leave it free to go in. Like a shul. Every shul has a fee, but nobody collects a fee at the door. In 1095, the Muslim world was overtaken by a tremendous rift within it, much like the rift that exists today in the Muslim world, between what are called the fundamentalists, those who believe in the Quran literally, and those Muslims that have made an accommodation to the fact that the world is not completely Muslim. The fundamentalists in 1095 took over in Egypt. It would be, Gaddafi, the true believers, the Hamas, all these guys, the Iranians, the Islamic Jihad. They're not new appearances on the scene. weren't invented in the 20th century. This is a struggle within the world of Islam that has existed almost from its beginning. It's 1,300 years old. And therefore, it's unlikely to be settled in the next 9 months. Unlikely. Maybe it can be, Alavai. But Libi Omer Li, to quote Rashi, my heart tells me that it's unlikely for that to happen. The fundamentalists said, Chutzpah, what do you mean we're allowing the Christians? They're infidels. They're non-believers. According to the Quran, they should all be put to death. But the Quran is a very dangerous book because it vents a lot of spleen. And it has no Torah Shabbal Peh Lahabdul to moderate it. So it says terrible things about the Jewish people. But in passing, it also says terrible things about the Christian world as well. So the fundamentalists said, listen, no more Church of the Holy Sepulchre, no more Bethlehem, no more Nativity, forget it. Only Muslims are allowed to come in. And they took Christians who existed in this country and they maltreated them, killed some of them. They closed the ports. And not only that, they said, we're not going to sell you salt, reed, salt, oil. We're not going to sell you salt for $20 a barrel anymore. Salt is $80 a barrel. We're not going to let you use our ports, our navies, our trade routes, unless you pay 4 or 5 times the original price. So again, the world is shocked. It's been going on a long time. This lecture, like all of mine, is vastly oversimplified because of me, not because of you. But I want you to understand the point, and I'm sure you do, and therefore that's why this oversimplification is taking place. The Christian world reeled. Economically, they were not prepared to pay 4 or 5 times the going prices. It would wreck their economy. And there were certain things that they could not do without. You can do without silk, but you can't do without salt. The Pope said, what do you mean the Christian holy places cannot be visited by the Christians? So the Pope declared the Christian version of a jihad, of a holy war. And the holy war was to free the Christian holy places from the dominance of the Muslims. The Pope had in mind that he was going to now have the largest army in Europe, far larger than the emperor had, that everyone would be under his dominance and control, and that he would now control the church as well, because all of the churchmen would work for this crusade. The first crusade took place overnight. The Pope proclaimed it in December of 1095. By April of 1096, there were over 40,000 armed Christians in Europe gathering for the trip east. Now we come to the Jewish part. How was the crusade sold? Again, the Havdal Elef Abdolis, but any good rabbi knows that you have to sell. Make sure Rabbeinu do it. Can't come and say, You have to do it. People, the more you proclaim that you have to do it, the less they're going to want to do it. One of the great problems of Torah in our generation is that it is insufficiently and perhaps not wisely marketed. Because if you have a great product, then you should be able to sell it. So how did the Pope propose to sell this? Why should a man who owned France leave France, walk across Europe, because they were not taking any planes, had to walk across Europe in the Middle Ages to fight the Muslims, to come here in the middle of the summer without air conditioning, in a chain suit and armor, can you imagine? Scale the walls, for what? So the Frume, so they're doing it l'shem shamayim. But there's a limited number of Frume. And he can't win the war with the Frume. He needed some knights and kings and soldiers who were notorious for not really being true believers. So he used three methods, all of which are important again for us to understand. The first concept, the first thing that he used was he sold indulgences. And indulgences as follows. In the Middle Ages, the Christian world believed that this life meant nothing. And that everything was the world to come. That's one of the major differences between Christianity and between Judaism, if I could use those expressions. By us, pikuach nefesh is doche everything. The three mitzvahs that it's not doche. And the Rambam says that even if the person violated those three mitzvahs, so then Bezdin cannot kill him. Bezdin cannot do anything to him. By us, human life, that's the first thing, right? You cannot say to someone, I'm going to kill you because that's going to get you to Olam Haba sooner. So religiously, I'm going to kill you, but the Catholic Church did so. The Catholic Church had a punishment called trial by ordeal, where they would take somebody and, let's say, tie him up with a bag of cement and throw him in the Rhine River. So if he survived, so then he was innocent, right? If he drowned, so then the church said Namonim show. If he was guilty, then he deserved to be drowned. And if he was innocent, they sent him to the world to come earlier. What could be better? Now, it may sound ludicrous, but this is theology. And thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people paid for this nonsense with their lives. So in the medieval world, by the Christians, human life meant nothing. And by the Muslims, human life meant nothing. That's the whole concept of the jihad today, right? People will blow themselves up because it's a mitzvah. We don't have any such mitzvahs. So on both sides, you have two foes to whom life means nothing. In the middle, you have a handful of Jews to whom life means everything. If you'll think about our little country, its location, its politics, its attitudes, you will see that that is part of our problem. They say that, true or not, it makes no difference again, but they say that Begin broke the day they gave him the casualty list from the Shalom Galil War. He saw that there were 600 dead, whatever, and then he had to send out people to the houses of 600 families here in Israel to tell them that their son died in a war that he sent them on that may not have been necessary. He never recovered from that. Pope never had those qualms. Neither did the Emperor of Egypt. Arafat loses no sleep. That's, that in Gaza, 15 people get killed in a week shooting each other. A different mindset. It's a different belief, a different faith. So the Pope invented this great idea the church has of indulgences. Indulgences are as follows. And if, in order to get to the world to come, you need a certain amount of points, let us say. I'm again oversimplifying. Let's say you need 100 points to get to the world to come. And the guy's a nice Christian, etc., but he did a lot of things wrong, killed a few people, he violated a few women. Okay, the regular knight of the Middle Ages. So nowadays, most people in the Middle Ages did not live to see their 40th birthday. The average life expectancy was 25. But that's because the infant mortality rate was almost 50%. But if you got past the age of 10, you probably wouldn't get past the age of 40. So let's say he's 39 years old, Jack Benny, and he has a year or two. What's he going to do? How's he going to get to the world to come? And he doesn't have 100 points. He's got 80 points. He's got to buy 20 points. It's like LL frequent flyer. So the church offered to sell him the 20 points. That was called an indulgence. Where did the church have the 20 points? So the church said, well, all the saints and the good Christians that have died throughout the ages, so let's say they also only needed 100 points to get into heaven. But he was such a righteous person, he had 150 points. The extra 50 points belongs to the church. So all the saints throughout the centuries, all of the extra points belong to the church, and the church can sell them. And the church did sell them. The splendor that is the Vatican today, St. Peter's Basilica, the Bernini doors, the Michelangelo ceiling, all were bought with indulgences. So the church said, anybody that goes on this crusade has an indulgence. 20 points. Big inducement in a world where this life means nothing and everything is in the world to come. Second selling point, absolution. Absolution, the church is more than an indulgence. Absolution is that the church has the right to write off all the sins. No matter what a person did, all the sins can be written off in one shot. The Pope took a page from jihad, from the Muslim warriors. The Muslims believe that a person who was killed in the holy war in jihad, so then that automatically guarantees his entry into the world to come. Again, no matter what he did during his lifetime. So therefore, what this did was encourage the worst people to participate in the Crusades, because they had the most to gain. They were the ones that needed full absolution. The nice guys didn't have to go. Either they had the 100 points without it, or they didn't need full absolution. And the third thing that the Pope promised, if these two spiritual gains were insufficient, then the Pope promised them a division of the spoils. And in the medieval world, it was built up that Jerusalem was paved with streets of gold, and that there were diamonds hanging on every building here, and that if you made it here, you're going to be a trillionaire, which was a little less than accurate. Because the city was small and dusty and poor, and there were no gold deposits to our knowledge in this country. Chazal say, Lama ein chamei Tveria b'Yerushalayim. Why do we not find that? Why doesn't Jerusalem have hot springs? Why doesn't it have, Mount Rushmore? Why doesn't it have waterfall? So Chazal say, because then people would come to Jerusalem for the waterfall or for the hot spring. The Rabbi Shalom took a rocky, not necessarily materially blessed place, and he called it Asher Yeomer Bayom Ahu Bahar Hashem Yeroeh. So that we don't have these illusions about it, but they had tremendous illusions. And this combination was able to rally at least 40,000 warriors, which in the Middle Ages was an enormous army. Most armies in the Middle Ages were numbered in the hundreds. And they set out. They set out in the spring of 1096. They were led by a man called Godfrey of Bouillon. Now, Godfrey of Bouillon would not be guilty of any anti-Jewish atrocities, even though in the Jewish history books he's written up as the villain. He would not be guilty of anything until they reached Jerusalem. And he would become the first king of Jerusalem. But there was a German. Most of the atrocities committed against the Jews in the Crusades were committed by Germans, which has a distressingly familiar ring. His name was Emich of Landsberg, and he commanded about 3,000 German soldiers and knights. And he said as follows: why do we have to go to the Middle East to find non-believers, infidels, enemies of Christianity? We have them here in our midst. How is it possible that we should travel half the world to fight the Muslims and let the Jews remain as they are in our midst? And that found a responsive chord. In the great Jewish communities of Spires and Worms and Mainz, Shum, Shin Vov Mem, Shapiro, Vermeise, Magenze. You know anybody named Shapiro? That's where the name comes from Spires. Those three great Jewish communities, the communities of Rabbeinu Gershon Mor Agola, where the great yeshivas were located, where Rashi had studied, were destroyed during the period of the Sphira, and Magenza was destroyed on the second day of Shavuos in 1096. Thousands of Jews were slaughtered. There was no controlling the mob. And the entire Jewish situation in Western Europe changed overnight. From being one of security, one of stability, it became one of terrible, terrible insecurity and instability. And the attitude of Jews changed. If you want to see it, you'll see what Rashi writes regarding Christianity, and you'll see what his grandson Rabbeinu Tam writes. Rashi wrote before the First Crusade. His grandson was almost killed in the Second Crusade. He was saved by the payment of an enormous ransom. Rabbeinu Tam writes about Christianity in unveiled, heavy, bitter terms. Mocks their pretense of love, of nonviolence. Rashi, however, is tolerant beyond words. Rashi lived through the First Crusade. It took place in 1096. Rashi didn't die until 1105. But the First Crusade broke Rashi. The last 5 years of his life, I mentioned to you, he spent in bed. It was not just physical, it was mental. Just as people were broken by the terrible events that occurred in our generation, that have occurred throughout the centuries. French and German Jewry, Ashkenazi Jewry would never be the same. First Crusade in 1098 finally reached Jerusalem after all sorts of slaughters on the way. Out of the original 30,000, only 4,200 made it to the Holy Land. And surprisingly enough, they were able to besiege Jerusalem and conquer it. In Yerushalayim in 1098, there were about 350 Jews. All of them were gathered by Godfrey of Bouillon in the synagogue, and the shul was burned down over their heads. But he was no nicer to the Muslims. He killed every Muslim that he found in Jerusalem. The dome of the rock, the mosque, was converted into a church. And the defeat of the Muslims was so complete that they were so demoralized that the church and the Christians felt that they had won the war. In effect, they had only won the first battle. So what happened was, out of the 4,200 knights, they came here, they looked around, they saw there's no money here. The climate was less than inviting to European sensitivities. So the Christians settled all along the coast. Antioch, Tyre, Sidon, and the main Christian locality in Palestine was not Jerusalem, but it was Acre. And they built fortresses which you can see today all over this country. Just massive fortresses that defy the imagination how human beings did this in the 12th century. How to drag those tremendous blocks of stone to the heights and mount them. If you've seen Kochav HaYarden Belvoir, or the fortress of Kalun Nimrod in the north, or even the Caesarea. I must say what I always say about all of these things. Whenever you go to see these fortresses, etc., so there's a little Israeli in front that charges you 12 shekel and rips off a piece of paper and gives it to you. So I always say to myself, if these people could stand up Tchias HaMesim and see who was charging whom money to see whose rooms. And we bring back Godfrey of Bouillon. Bring them back. Emmett, Pope Urban II, Saladin, Suleiman the Magnificent. Bring them back. And say, here, now, what do you say now? Jews have to remember that. Otherwise we lose sight of the entire panorama that is occurring. We only see the small picture. You have to see the big picture. Nobody wanted to stay in Palestine. Less than 1,000 crusaders remained. You cannot conquer a country and settle it and own it with 1,000 people. And therefore, Jerusalem remained Christian for only about 88 years. And then the great Emperor Saladin, and the Rambam was his doctor. See how God does things. Salah al-Din, the Emperor of Egypt, the Rambam was his doctor. He reconquered the country, and he reconquered Jerusalem. But on the advice of the Rambam, he gave the Crusaders the right to leave. He did not slaughter them. He gave them the right to leave. They retired to Acre. And on the advice of the Rambam, he allowed the Jews to return to Yerushalayim. But the Jews were so frightened that they were unable to mount a minyan. A century later, almost, the Ramban will come to Yerushalayim and he'll say, I only found 6 Jews in Yerushalayim. So the Ramban went by donkey to Shechem, and he convinced 2 brothers who were dyers to move from Shechem to Yerushalayim. He had 8. And then he went to Hebron. He talked about getting the minyan. We don't like to stand outside and say, Mari, we don't like that. Here, He went to Shem and he got 2. And he went to Hebron and he got 2. When he had a minyan, out of his own money, he purchased a building in the old city of Jerusalem, the Beit Knesset Ramban. The building stood as a shul from the year 1268 until our cousins in 1948 destroyed it. The Ramban said, how could it be that Yerushalayim shouldn't have a minyan? The Rambam held al pi halacha that you always have to have a minyan Jews in Yerushalayim, because the Rambam holds al pi halacha that the Jewish calendar is dependent upon the observance of the Rosh Chodesh in Yerushalayim and Eretz Yisrael. And he said if there wouldn't be Jews in Yerushalayim and Eretz Yisrael, then we cannot be Mekadosh the Chodesh anymore. And that means all of Judaism would somehow fall apart. So he convinced his friend the Emperor Saladin to let the Jews come back. A second crusade was mounted, which ended in failure even before Saladin was able to conquer Yerushalayim, because the Christians saw that they were unable to maintain. The third crusade, which is the most famous crusade because it had Richard the Lionhearted and it had the King Philip of France, had the main players, attempted to come and take the country back. And when they were unsuccessful, by the way, if you want to see the place of the battle of Saladin against the Crusaders, it's about 1.5 kilometers outside of Kibbutz Lavi. The horns of Chittim, Karnei Chittim. So that's one of the oldest battlefields in the world. It's mentioned in Tanakh. Yoshua bin Nun fought the Canaanite kings there. Josephus marks it as the place where the Roman legions defeated the Jewish armies prior to the destruction of the Second Temple. And that is the place where Saladin defeated the Christian armies. Cut them off, cut their access to Yerushalayim. He starved them to death. They had no water. They couldn't get back to Tiberias, to the Sea of Galilee. On a bitter, hot July day, they all expired. It's a very bloody country. The Third Crusade was unsuccessful. Not only was it unsuccessful, it dawned upon the Christians that they would never succeed. And it dawned upon the Muslims also that the Christians would never succeed. The Muslims make the mistake, and you'll hear it over and over again in all of their propaganda that they say to themselves and to the world, that the Muslim heartland will not allow the absorption of an alien, foreign, different power or faith in their midst. And their proof of it is the Crusades. Because they fought the 220-year war until Acre fell. Acre fell 220 years after the First Crusade began. But they drove the Christians out of the country completely. Not one fortress was left. The Christians left with no rights, with nothing gained. But they left with a legacy of blood, and certainly a legacy of hatred against the Jews. The Jews who lived here, the Jews who lived in Europe. The Jews were accused by the church of praying for a Muslim victor. Here you have also the dysfunctional attitude of the church, that why should God listen to Jewish prayers? If the Jews are all wrong and cursed and etc., so who cares who the Jews pray for? So on one hand, the Jews have to pray for the Christians. On the other hand, the prayer means nothing. The Pope is in for an operation. You know that in the famous Jewish story, my uncle, Zechron Baruch, told me the story. My uncle came from Sluisk in Lithuania. So the Tsar took ill. Alexander III, who was not a popular man amongst the Jews, he took ill. So when he took ill, so the Russian police and the Russian Orthodox priest came to the shul, and they said, everybody has to say Tehillim for the Tsar's recovery. So there was not too enthusiastic a response. So they said, well, we demand that somebody come to the Omer and lead in the public recitation of Tehillim for the Tsar. So one little Jew went up there, he said he's going to say Tehillim for the Tsar. So he said, okay, start. So he said, Lamakim lochim gedolim kilolom chazdo, vayarom lochim adirim kilolom chazdo. That was the Jewish attitude. It hasn't changed either. So the king of Jordan was the first one to send flowers to the Pope. So the Jews were caught in a terrible dilemma. And the Jews attempted to escape, and the Christians attempted to help them escape. In the 13th century, the Jews were expelled from France. In the 13th century, they were expelled from England. In the 15th century, they'd be expelled from Spain. And the policy of the church was conversion, extermination, expulsion. And that's how the Ashkenazim came east. They crossed Germany to get away from the Germans. They left Bohemia to get away from the Slavs. And they came to what they thought would be more hospitable territory. Poland, Lithuania, eventually Russia. All to escape the crusade mentality. The crusade mentality was built upon the fact that the Jew was the internal enemy of the church. And that no matter what he did in the country, he was going to undermine it. And that is a charge that we have never been able to answer satisfactorily. And we've never been able to escape from the consequences of it. So when we discuss, God willing, next time, the rise of Rabbeinu Tam and the Balei Tesvis, Rashi's grandchildren, we have to see it in this perspective. A, that they did all of this great work in spite of constant persecution and danger of extermination. And B, that they always had their bags packed. That they did not feel any longer that they were part of the society that they lived in. The Crusades unnerved them. It destabilized the Jewish world. And in that destabilization, many, many factors now would come to the fore that would help to form the Ashkenazic Jewry that we know and that most of us are descendants of in the present form that we know it today. Thank you.